Today I have for you two truly epic games between Magnus Carlsen and the strongest 13-year-old chess genius on the planet, Yağız Erdoğmuş, who's already ranked number 170 in the world and is growing stronger by the day. In our first game, you're going to see Magnus go full beast mode as he begins sacrificing material on move 4 and doesn't let up, going on to sacrifice two whole pieces, setting the board ablaze, and requiring his prodigious young opponent to navigate a very difficult and terrifying landscape. Is Yağız up to the task? Well, all I'm going to tell you is that someone is going down in a blaze of glory. The second game is fantastic as well. You might like it even better, and the winner is the player who lost in the first game. So that's all I'm going to say for now. I want to get right into our game number 1. Both are 3-minute blitz played just this past week on chess.com. Magnus has the white pieces here, and he opens with e4. To which Yağız responds d5, the Scandinavian defense. An opening which has never quite enjoyed the same level of respect given to some of its peers like c5, e5, c6, or e6, as it allows e takes d5, played now by Magnus, when after the immediate recapture queen takes d5, played by Yağız, Magnus now has knight to c3, developing a piece with an attack on the queen, which white will try to argue has been brought out prematurely. Yağız responds with the most popular book move, queen to a5, which brings us to the first sacrifice of the game, here on move 4, where Magnus plays b4, known as the Leonhardt gambit. It's not a popular move, even in online blitz, since after the obvious queen takes b4, now played by Yağız, all white really gets out of the sacrificed pawn is the chance to get his rook to a now opened file with rook to b1, while attacking the queen, which Yağız now retreats to d6. So is this really worth giving up a pawn over? Well, the engine is going to tell you hell no, but it doesn't say white is losing and actually evaluates this position as being close to equal. So in a blitz game, I really like this for white. I mean, you're getting your pieces active while probably throwing your opponent out of his comfort zone, and you're not losing. What more do you want? So don't hesitate to try this at home. Magnus continues knight to f3. We have knight to f6, d4, very normal looking stuff. e6 from Yağız, looking to play bishop to e7 and then castle quickly. It is noteworthy that this blocks the light squared bishop, so it's interesting that he didn't play g6 instead, which may be just a tad stronger. Next is bishop to d3, bishop to e7, castles and castles, bringing us to the interesting decision to play knight to e4, allowing knight takes e4, bishop takes e4, and knight to d7, headed to f6, with tempo on that e4 bishop, which Magnus surely must have anticipated. So what is he getting out of this? Well, since there is no longer the knight on c3, he can now get his c-pawn moving with c4, threatening c5, hitting the black queen, who is a bit short on squares for the moment. There's also the idea to capture the pawn on b7, and then after rook to b8, you're not losing the bishop, which would be pinned to the rook on b1, if not for the move bishop to e4, defending the rook, only made possible because there is no longer that pawn on c2. Yağız now plays a very good move, c5, preventing c5 from white, although allowing bishop takes b7. But Magnus doesn't go for this, since after rook to b8, bishop to e4, rook takes b1, bishop takes b1, c takes d4, knight takes d4, and bishop to b7, white has equalized the pawn count, but in doing so has allowed black to activate his light squared bishop, now pointed at his king side. He's also got the split pawns on the queen side. His passed c pawn is not going anywhere as black has the c5 square on lockdown. So this is clearly not in the spirit of Magnus's opening play so far. He's here to sack and attack, which is why in the game he plays rook to b3. A very strong, engine-approved move, giving the rook some lateral attacking potential on the king side, while also anticipating c takes d4, now played by Yağız, to which Magnus can now respond with bishop to a3, attacking the queen, defended by that rook. If the queen moves, then the bishop on e7 falls, so Yağız has no choice but to abandon any knight to f6 plan he may have had, and must play knight to c5. Which does not come with a threat to white's bishop or rook, as the knight is now pinned to the queen. Magnus increases the pressure on the knight now with rook to b5, which marks the beginning of a very ambitious plan. Pause the video if you'd like and see if you can determine what exactly is the purpose of this move rook to b5. What most of you will probably notice right away is the obvious threat of bishop takes c5, just winning a piece, unless black wants to part with his queen. Black would love to play b6 here to support the knight, but then the a8 rook hangs. So Yağız plays queen to c7, the knight is defended twice, it's no longer pinned to the queen, which means knight takes e4 is threatened. If white moves that bishop, then b6 can now be played, securing the knight, and making this move rook to b5 look rather silly. But Magnus does not retreat his bishop, because his plan all along was bishop takes c5, when the presence of the rook on b5 now prevents queen takes c5, which means Yağız must now recapture with the bishop, and this was the whole point. Some of you might already know why, but if you don't, take a few minutes and study the entire board and see if you can work out why Magnus wanted that bishop off of e7. Here's a clue. It involves a sacrifice. It's a Greek sacrifice, and it's now executed by Magnus with the move bishop takes h7 check. And this type of sacrifice, commonly referred to as the Greek gift, is one that most players will become familiar with fairly early in their chess journey. White is sacrificing his bishop in order to draw the black king out with king takes h7, now played by Yağız, after which we see the point of drawing black's bishop away from e7, which is that Magnus can now play the standard follow-up knight to g5 check, and there's no bishop takes g5 available to black, which means his king must move. Now the thing to remember about the Greek gift sacrifice is this: sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. It really depends on the specifics of the position, and knowing when you should play it and when you shouldn't often requires a good deal of calculation. Now in this thematic position we see before us, very often king to g8 will be the best move for black. But here it would fail to a spectacular tactical sequence, which I just gotta show you. This wasn't played in the game, but after queen to h5, threatening mate on h7, and rook to d8, this would be one of those cases where the sacrifice is just losing for white, if not for a single move that gives him the advantage. Pause the video and try to spot it, but here it is. White must play rook takes c5. Regaining the piece with a better position despite being a pawn down, since the black king's position is still looking pretty shaky. And of course the obvious question in everyone's mind is going to be, what happens if black recaptures on c5? Well, this fails to queen takes f7 check, king to h8, queen to h5 check, king to g8, queen to h7 check, king to f8. These are all only moves for black. And now comes queen to h8 check, forcing the king onto e7, followed by queen takes g7 check, giving black the choice of playing either king to e8 and getting checkmated with queen to f7, or his only other legal move, king to d6, which runs into knight to e4 check, with the fork picking up the black queen. Incredible. So did Yağız calculate all this out? In this position, where he rejected king to g8 and played the paradoxical king to g6, moving his king toward the center of the board? It wouldn't surprise me, but what does surprise me is that this move king to g6 is not only the best move, but it actually gives black a winning position, if and only if he is able to find the correct defense, which is not so obvious. So let's see if Yağız is up to the task. Magnus plays knight to e4, which is the best move, and one that looks fairly terrifying for black, attacking the bishop on c5 a second time while threatening to come into g4 with the queen, which, as you're going to see, would be so devastating that black's best defense here, which Yağız unfortunately did not play, is f5. You gotta keep that queen out of g4, even at the cost of giving up that bishop on c5, which remarkably heavily favors black no matter how white captures it. If knight takes c5, then there's a6, attacking the rook, which will not be able to maintain defense of the knight. So best here is rook takes c5, attacking the queen, but after queen to f4, suddenly it's white who is in trouble, being a pawn down with his knight still under attack. The rook is sitting on a weird square here on c5, The black king is no longer in any real jeopardy, whereas white is facing rook to h8, converging on h2. Black can potentially get his bishop to this long diagonal. So the engine is giving knight to g3 and then b6, attacking the rook, giving a heavy advantage to black, probably winning. But Yağız, unfortunately, did not see the virtues of giving the piece back. Here in our game position, where he decided to defend the bishop on c5 with b6, which is a blunder of the highest order, in that it gives white a checkmate by force, beginning with the move Magnus plays next, which of course is queen to g4 check. Yağız retreats his king to h7, we have another check on h5, the king goes to g8, at which point I invite you to find the only winning move for white in this position. It's a move that incredibly Magnus misses. A forced mate in 10, beginning with knight to f6 check, g takes f6, it's black's only move, and now we have queen to g4 check, king to h7, and rook to b3, threatening rook to h3 checkmate, which black can only delay by throwing pieces in the way now with moves like d3, and after rook takes d3, bishop to e3, rook takes e3, queen to f4, stuff like that. So it's quite remarkable that Magnus missed this relatively simple forced mate, and in the game, after king to g8, opted for the losing move knight to g5, which is the standard follow-up after a Greek gift sacrifice, threatening checkmate on h7, but here it's not working. Yağız plays rook to e8, he's got to give his king a square. Now a pretty common way to follow up here would be queen to h7 check, and after king to f8, queen to h8 check, and king to e7. White has queen takes g7. But Magnus can see that this goes nowhere. His knight and queen are just not enough to make anything happen, so he knows he needs to try to get another piece involved with rook to b3, but Yağız responds with an excellent move, bishop to b7, preventing rook to f3, which was white's biggest threat, honing in on f7. So Magnus, probably sensing that he now has a losing position and perhaps beginning to feel a bit tilted, continues to play inaccurately with f4, apparently hoping to cause some disruption with the move f5, but after d3 discovered check, king to h1, and rook a to d8, now the white rook is cut off from the action by black's advancing past pawn, now supported by a rook, very ominous. Magnus now plays his checking sequence with queen to h7 check, king to f8, queen to h8 check, king to e7, and grabs that g-pawn with queen takes g7, now threatening to take on f7, but after rook to f8 defending, Magnus's attack has run out of steam. He could try f5, but that is actually quite harmless. Black can just ignore it and push his pawn to d2 when neither f6 check or even f takes e6 is going to put his winning advantage in any real jeopardy. So Magnus, with desperation mode fully activated, decides to go all in now with an absolutely savage sacrifice of a second piece with knight takes e6. With the triple fork, taking advantage of the pin on the f-pawn, which may not recapture, but Yağız, unintimidated, just fearlessly recaptures with his king, which is now extremely exposed, sitting on the open file near the center of the board. But does Magnus have sufficient firepower left to do anything about it? Well, he's gonna try, starting with the move queen to g4 check. Yağız blocks with the f-pawn. Here comes the rook to e1 with check. The king goes to d7, blocking his rook's defense of the d-pawn, which now falls to rook to d3 check. But after king to c8, Magnus's awful truth is becoming painfully obvious. And that is that the black king has made it to safety, leaving white's dwindling army flailing amidst the ruins of his failed attack. Magnus is a full 2 pieces down with only 2 extra pawns to show for it. His queen is under attack, so is his rook on d3. So he plays rook takes d8 check, and after queen takes d8, Magnus plays on for a bit, maybe hoping to flag Yağız, who is down to only about 20 seconds on his clock, whereas Magnus still has about a minute. But from here, Yağız is able to play virtually instantly, using less than a second per move for the remainder of this game, which goes as follows. Queen to g6, rook to g8, queen takes f5 with check, queen to d7, queen takes d7 check, king takes d7, rook to e2, defending g2, which is attacked twice. And now we get a very cute move, bishop to f3, hitting the rook. The bishop may not be captured, or else rook to g1 is checkmate. So play continues rook to d2 check, king to e6, h3, giving the king a square so that g takes f3 is possible. But now Yağız just simplifies the position with rook takes g2, and after rook takes g2 and king to f5, the white rook is pinned. Magnus plays king to h2, unpinning, but after bishop takes g2, king takes g2, and king takes f4, Magnus, seeing that Yağız still has 16 seconds left on his clock, in a greatly simplified position and having only one extra pawn for Yağız's bishop, with no hope whatsoever of drawing the game, does finally resign. So what a beautiful disaster that game was for Magnus, who came so close to winning, even after being a bit too generous with an unsound Greek gift sacrifice, somehow missing the forced mate, desperately sacking a second piece, and then going down in a blaze of glory. You gotta respect it, but moving on to our second game. This one I'm going to go through much more quickly, just so you can see Magnus put this young whippersnapper back in his place, this time with a successful attack. So I'm going to keep the commentary and analysis to a relative minimum in this one. Let me know in the comments what you think of the more rapid format. If you like it a lot, I might do it more often, but let's get right into it. Magnus again has the white pieces and opens with d4. Yağız responds knight to f6, and after c4 from Magnus, he plays b6, known as the accelerated Queen's Indian, as indicated by this early b6. Usually e6 will come first. Play continues with some natural development, knight to f3, bishop to b7, g3, and g6. Both players planning a kingside fianchetto. Magnus seizes some central territory with d5. Is it a strong move, or is he overextending? Stockfish suspects the latter, but only if black plays the weird-looking b5 to undermine the defense of the d5 pawn. Yağız doesn't play that. He goes with the more natural bishop to g7. We have knight to c3, castles, and now e4. Another less than ideal pawn move. Better was to just play bishop to g2 and then castle, and this time Yağız does find the best response, e6. Challenging that center, maybe looking to exchange pawns, open things up a bit, and try to inconvenience Magnus for not castling quicker. We have bishop to d3 from Magnus, which looks like an admission of failure, just giving up on the fianchetto of the bishop to g2, which makes the move g3 look a lot less useful. But he's decided that e4 needs more protection now in view of e takes d5, when white should not recapture with the e-pawn, opening the file to his king. So after c takes d5 and rook to e8, e4 is adequately defended and white can just castle. But Yağız waits on the pawn exchange and plays knight to a6, which is a fine move, looking for knight to c5 next. Magnus now castles. We have knight to c5, hitting Magnus's bishop, which is sort of a bad bishop, being on the same colored squares as his central pawn wedge, but is it bad enough to allow the knight for bishop trade? Magnus doesn't think so, and he plays bishop to c2. And we now get an inaccuracy from Yağız with the move bishop to a6, which looks very good on the surface. It's attacking c4, which white doesn't have a great way to defend. b3 would weaken the long dark square diagonal along which the g7 bishop is lurking, and thus fails tactically to knight takes d5. Queen to e2 runs into e takes d5. The c-pawn is pinned. If you play e takes d5, then there's rook to e8 hitting the queen. That's no good either. But Magnus doesn't have to defend that c-pawn because he now has e5. Which is the best move? Attacking the knight. It goes to g4, hitting e5 twice. c4 is still attacked. Is Magnus going to lose a pawn? No, because he has b4. A move which black should not have allowed, at least not with his bishop sitting on a6. The engine was actually saying to play a5 first to prevent this move b4. But now Yağız has a problem. His knight on c5 only has one safe square to which it can retreat, and that is b7. Only trouble is, that would lose the a6 bishop to b5, trapping it. But all is not lost for Yağız, as he finds the only move to keep himself in the game, and that is knight takes e5. letting the knight on c5 fall to b takes c5, because now he can grab a couple more pawns for the piece with bishop takes c4, with tempo on the rook, followed by knight takes f3 check, and then e takes d5. So that would still favor white a bit, but black would have decent chances. But Yağız now takes on c4 with the wrong piece. He plays knight takes c4, which looks pretty good on the surface with a discovered attack on the c3 knight, the threat of a discovered attack on the f1 rook, but now Magnus finds another only move to give white a winning position. Try to spot it if you'd like. Good luck. It's far from obvious to me, but the move is bishop to g5, attacking the queen. If the queen moves, then white has knight to e4. Happy to sack the exchange on a1 in order to get that knight into f6. That would be horrible for black. So Yağız plays f6, attacking the bishop while blocking his own bishop's diagonal. Magnus drops his bishop back to c1. Yağız realizes that his only hope lies in activating his dark squared bishop, and so he reopens its diagonal with f5. But this of course allows Magnus to just put his bishop right back on g5, which he now does. The black queen is hit, Yağız moves her to e8, and now with his pawn on f5, at least there's no knight to e4 from white targeting the f6 square, which now has some extra defense anyway by the f8 rook. But Magnus does have a winning move here, and that is bishop to b3, just giving the piece back, but he doesn't play it. The point is that after bishop takes c3, there's rook to c1, threatening to win one of these pieces. Now black does have knight to b2 hitting the queen, but after queen to c2 and bishop to g7, the engine gives rook f to e1 as totally winning for white. And it's not even worried about knight to d3 forking the rooks, and says that white's threat to capture that pinned e6 pawn is way more dangerous, and so recommends bishop to d3 for black here. So that's your token crazy engine line of the game, which we could just keep exploring, but I want to get back to the human realm after queen to e8 from Yağız, where Magnus plays the incorrect knight to e2, offering Yağız the rook on a1, which he should not accept before first playing h6 and kicking that g5 bishop. The idea is to force it back to a square where the c4 knight will be able to capture it, uncovering an attack on the e2 knight. Then after bishop takes a1, drawing the queen away from the knight's defense, it can be picked up with bishop takes e2. So that's the basic idea, and there are things white can do to counter this, which we're not going to delve into, but suffice to say that black will emerge with a significant, yet probably non-winning advantage. But Yağız goes ahead and plays bishop takes a1, which is a blunder. Magnus recaptures with the queen, of course, but now there is no h6, as it would simply drop a pawn. Magnus has the two minor pieces for the rook. Yağız does have a couple of extra pawns at the moment, but with his weakened kingside, Magnus is the one with all the attacking chances. Yağız continues e5. It's as good a move as any, shutting the door on the queen's diagonal, trying to keep the position as closed as possible, doesn't want any central pawn trades. We have rook to e1, defending the e2 knight, putting the rook opposite black's queen, which will become significant in just a couple of moves. Yağız plays d6, bolstering his e5 pawn, but now we have c takes d6, c takes d6, and knight to f4, making use of this discovered pin on the e5 pawn by that e1 rook, and things are starting to look a bit nasty, with that knight about to infiltrate to e6, though apparently knight to d4 was much stronger since it keeps black's queen out of b5 with knight to c6 if necessary. Why is this important? Well, queen to b5 would give black some nice activity, attacking d5, looking for queen to b2 to try to trade those queens, but Yağız just abandons that useful diagonal now with the inaccurate move queen to f7. Rook to f7 was the better move. Magnus plays his knight to e6, hitting the rook. It moves to the open file. We have bishop to b3 from Magnus, getting out of the view of the rook on c8. He doesn't want any nonsense like knight to a3 with tempo on the bishop followed by knight to c2. Next is knight to a5, looking for that knight for bishop trade, but Magnus is fine with that. He simply ignores it and plays bishop to h6, clearing the way for knight to g5, which is coming post-haste. We do have knight takes b3, a takes b3, bishop to b7, targeting d5, but here we go with knight f to g5, hitting the queen. She goes to f6. Rook to d1 defends the pawn. Yağız pushes f4, but Magnus just captures with g takes f4. And black has no way to recapture without losing his queen. But Yağız saw that coming, and he just wanted to get his queen to f5, hoping to cause some trouble with queen to g4 check. But Magnus simply prevents that with h3, defended by the knight. And now what? Well, there is rook to c2, which is kind of nice cosmetically, but it doesn't really threaten anything. I mean, I guess black can double his rooks on the open file, but even that is quite harmless. Magnus has his kingside completely under control and now continues with queen to a3, attacking d6, which Yağız has no good way to defend. The e6 knight is covering both d8 and f8, so what's tried is e4, I guess going for e3 next. But before Magnus has the chance to respond, Yağız Erdoğmuş resigns the game. Queen takes d6 is unstoppable, and that would just be curtains for black, with the engine giving mate in 12, but even worse is the move queen to a1. And how is black stopping checkmate on g7? He's not. He can only delay it by sacrificing pieces. And this is most likely what Yağız was anticipating when he decided to throw in the towel. So what a magnificent struggle this game was, so rich in tactical possibilities and instructive moments. Let me know in the comments which one of these two games you enjoyed the most. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed this content and would like to see more of it on the regular, and I will see you soon.